This is also posted on our page, Sidonia, or will be?
Yes.
It is, okay. So if anybody wants to pull it up on your own device, it'd be under today, it would be under today's date. Welcome, Mike.
This is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council. I'm going to walk through with you those actions that the House Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry took last biennium, including those acts that were enacted, bills that passed out of committee, but may not have wound up as an act, but were included in other bills, and then bills that passed out of the committee that were not enacted, but did have some significant action on them. So you will see that there's a couple of different tables in the document, and I'm going to walk through. The first table is those acts that the House Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry worked on last biennium. The first was Act number 21. As the name of this committee reflects, you have jurisdiction in the House over forestry issues. The Department of Forests and Parks came to you to look for some additional authority about when to issue burning permits or to issue no burning permits. And that's what Act 21 did. It authorized A&R to approve in writing during periods of increased fire hazard, specific periods during which no burning permits shall be issued by town fire.
I think there was a time this fall when the department used that authority.
Yep. The next Act number 42, as the members that have been on the committee, but previously, there is always an miscellaneous agricultural subjects bill. It is a bill that's asked for by the agency. They usually ask for it at the end of January after the governor's budget has been announced. And traditionally, the House chair and the Senate chair divvy up which one subjects the two committees will deal with. I don't know if you're going to continue that practice, but what you will see is that there's a miscellaneous House bill and a miscellaneous Senate bill. And so the Act number 42 was the miscellaneous Senate bill from 2023. A lot of what's in the miscellaneous bills are technical, but they can also be substantive. And for example, in 42 in 2023, the agency asked for clarification on their quarantine authority for domestic animals that are suspected of having been exposed to chemical agents that may cause milk or dairy products to be adulterated. They didn't technically have that if the milk was chemically contaminated, and they wanted to clarify that they have that quarantine authority in those instances. They also updated the state's law regarding the sale of eggs, which hadn't been updated since the 70s. They increased the maximum amount of their administrative penalties, and they clarified that municipalities cannot assess stormwater fees on property. Those municipalities with stormwater utilities were assessing farms impact fee, and the statute says that farming is exempt from stormwater regulation if it met the RAPs. But they really didn't have authority to regulate them. And there was a little bit of a tension there because the municipalities have been regulating them, which meant that they were getting revenue from the farms. And some of the revenue was pretty significant because some of the impervious surface on some of the larger farms, especially in Franklin County, was, I think one farm was like a $50,000 fee. And so the town was like, how are we going to get our $50,000 that we've been counting on in our budget? But they're going to have to figure that out because they can't.
I would just interject here again that I would say, generally speaking, what the agency brings to us in these miscellaneous bills are technical changes, typically controversial, not terribly political.
Right.
This was an unusual one, and we had a lot of interesting debate and a lot of there were some concerned parties.
So moving on from,
Just quickly, what would be a biological or chemical agent that would adulterate milk?
that's a great question. At the time, I thought it was PFAS when they first introduced it, but they said, no, it's just like certain chemicals from medicine or other supplements that might get into the milk. And they had a discrete case and so that's something that you would talk to them about. I can't recall what the specific chemical.
But going forward, it's not PFAS or microplastics. We'd have to do something special for that too.
No, because that would be a biological or chemical agent that may cause.
Be covered under that. Okay.
We're going to talk to you about PFAS too, because EPA just issued
Yes, they did.
yeah. So the next is Act 73 from 2023. This is the House miscellaneous bill from that year. One of the big things it did is it clarified how the Ag Fair and Field Days grants were issued. There had been a mix-up about for years. There had been a rule that set forth how the formula, how the grants were made. But that rule was adopted under the Racing Commission's rule authority. And the government ops committees said, we don't have a racing commission anymore. We can repeal all of those statutes. And unbeknownst to them, by doing that, they repealed the Ag Fairs rule. And so that there needed to be new authority for the grants to the Ag Fairs, and that's what you did. It generally followed what the Racing Commission rule had been, but it tweaked it a little bit. It's a little bit more fair now, and it can also be targeted to certain needs. Weights and Measures is a committee's jurisdiction as well, because it's an agency of ag jurisdiction. You looked at how and what time frame the agency had to inspect certain new weight devices. It had previously said that had to be inspected within a year, and now they have up to 24 months. You repealed the requirement for the agency to issue livestock brands. They hadn't been issuing them, and so they're not going to issue them. It took that statutory authority off the books. You amended the apiary laws, specifically about whether or not a certificate of health was needed for bees that are transported out of state to do pollination and then brought back into the state. For a while, they were exempt if they were not moved that far away from the border, but the agency says they could still be diseased even if they're only 45 miles away. And so they still want that certificate of health to come back in. You brought hydroponic farming materials into the registration requirements for feed, seed, supplements. You required persons distributing and installing nursery stock to get a nursery dealer license. You repealed the requirement that the agency compensate owners of nursery stock when their stock is diseased. And you extended the sales tax exemption on advanced wood boilers. Last year, 2024, you amended the inspection requirements for poultry to eliminate there is an exemption from poultry inspection so that the state doesn't have to inspect certain type of poultry before it is slaughtered and sold. But that inspection exemption said that the bird had to be sold as a whole bird. And last year, you eliminated the whole bird requirement, which a lot of farmers were happy about, to allow the farmers who are operating under the exemption to sell parts of the bird instead of the whole bird. Act 153 from last year was a forestry Act related to land improvement fraud and timber trespass. You may all know that timber trespass has been an issue in Vermont for a long time, whether or not it's the unintentional logging over property lines or it's the intentional fraudulent activity where bad actors are going onto land and logging where they know they shouldn't be. There was issues with enforcement of that. You amended the one of the Attorney General's authorities for basically development fraud, and said that land improvement fraud, which would include that actions of people intentionally cutting down to frauding people, you gave the Attorney General additional authority to enforce those violations. They are supposed to come back with a report to you by January 15th with some additional information. I have not seen that report yet, but it is January 15th, so maybe it comes in today, maybe it doesn't. The next act was Act 167, and this didn't really come into your committee. It was here. You got a drive-by walkthrough kind of it. So animal welfare issues in the state have been problematic for a long time. Nobody had currently, well, previously to this act, there was no central state entity that had coordinated authority over administering and enforcing animal welfare laws in the state. So if you called the Agency of Agriculture and said there's an animal welfare issue with these dogs, that the Agency of Agriculture said we don't regulate that. If you called the Department of Public Safety and said there's these issues with these cows or horses, Department of Public Safety said, yes, that's a crime, but we don't have the capacity to do that right now. And so there was basically everyone acknowledged there was an issue with the animal welfare requirements in the state and how they were enforced, but nobody really wanted the potato. So last year you created an animal welfare division at the Department of Public Safety. Currently, there's only one person in that division. That person is supposed to come up with a plan on how to better implement and administer and enforce animal welfare laws in the state. And that plan has to come to you next year. And then you would have to act on that. If you wanted to implement that plan, you would have to most likely adopt statute to do that.
You should have that person in.
Has that person been hired?
So you gave the Department of Public Safety until January 1st to basically implement the law because they had said they had so much stuff going on.
Okay.
But I know that they are putting out the ad. There was some media coverage of this whole issue maybe a month ago, and the department said that they were preparing the ad to hire the person.
So the enactment date was not until December 31st or?
Yeah, January.
Okay. So if by the end of the session that person's been appointed, we can get some.
So Act 101 from last year, you designated the bear's head tooth mushroom as a state mushroom. And then Act 182 of last year related to the regulation or prohibition of certain uses of neonicotinoid pesticides beginning July 1, 2025. And then there's some phased-in requirements and prohibitions. And then prohibited the use of neonicotinoid treated article seed beginning July 1, 2029. The agency may issue exemptions from the prohibition if supply of seed is insufficient or present serious financial hardship. As you know, New York also implemented a ban. Vermont's ban has effective dates that are tied to New York, so that if New York amends its law or repeals it so that there wouldn't be supply of seed, then Vermont's law would not go into effect. So.
Senator O'Brien?
Just remind me, we took a lot of testimony on orchards using, spraying, but none of that actually made it into the final act.
Well, that's actually a discussion you may want to have with the agency about how they are interpreting the act and how they're prohibiting certain uses where the act may not have prohibited that. And so there's a little bit of there's two reasonable interpretations. One, the agency is taking and prohibiting its use, and one where they could have taken it and allowed its use. And I had a little back and forth with them about that. You might want to talk to them about that.
I just wondered, can they do things in rules did we give them leeway to do things in rules that still?
They do have rulemaking authority here to deal with it, but statute always trumps rule. And so they can't do anything that would conflict with the statute.
I think that the area of the question here is not spraying in orchards, but application on perennials that are arguably, maybe the language was decorative,
Yeah.
something like that. Ornamental, yeah. Rather than on commercial fruit trees. Representative Nelson.
It also saved the golf courses, right? So they can spray the golf courses with neonics.
I think that was left in as an exception.
I'd have to double check,
That's great.
have it here with me. Yeah, I think they were.
We can go into, we can have the agency come in and give us an update on the areas that are maybe questionable too, and go into more detail.
I'm gonna have to double check, but I don't see an exemption for golf courses.
Like I recall that was in the final bill. It was included. It was a one-time, the last couple of days of June. First couple of days of July, or one-time days. By Saturdays.
Yeah, I don't see that. I think maybe that could be the interpretation of the prohibition, but I don't see that specifically. I'll look into it some more.
The New York bill was just about treated articles, right? Not spraying.
No, it was about more than just treated articles.
What was?
They had an ornamental plant ban and they had a couple other provisions.
Is it New York allowing them though to spray their vegetable crops? They have huge fields out there in western New York.
Yeah, big orchards.
You can still spray certain vegetable crops in Vermont, and it's really about when they're in bloom. You can't apply pesticides to any crop during bloom. You can't apply it to soybeans or any crop in the cereal grains group. And you can't apply it to leafy vegetables, et cetera, harvested after bloom. But there are crops that you can still apply it to, and that don't fall into this category.
I'm wondering whether the original drafted version had golf courses spelled out and then that section was removed.
I believe that's what happened.
Implicit.
The Senate would not move the bill unless they were exempted. And then it came
That's
back.
possible, yeah.
And we-
I just don't see that.
Then you talked to the agency, didn't you, Dave, about
What it
On
had,
trees too, right? Like injections.
Yeah,
what had previously been in the bill was that there had been a prohibition, an application to turf. And turf was removed. And so that might be the interpretation, because there's no longer a ban on application to turf. It can now be used on golf courses. But it doesn't exempt golf courses specifically. It just doesn't have a prohibition that would apply to applications to.
that sounds about right.
Sorry about that. Sometimes I have to kickstart the memory. Act 160 of 2024 was the House miscellaneous ag bill from last year. It amended some of the eligibility for farm agronomic practices, which is a water quality assistance program. It did some weights and measures changes. It allowed for remote certification of pesticide applicators. It tweaked some of the mosquito control provisions, and it amended some of the provisions related to fertilizer lines, plant amendments, plant biostimulants, and soil amendments. And then Act 141 was the Senate miscellaneous ag bill last year. It amended the eligibility and criteria for participating in the seeding and filter strip program, again, a water quality assistance program. It eliminated the need for milk handlers and slaughterhouses to also have an ag warehouse license in certain situations. It amended the eligibility for the Vermont Ag Credit Program, making that more open and making the activities funded, more activities eligible, like farmer housing. It prohibited pet shops from selling dogs and cats, and it prohibited the sale of paws and internal organs of black bears. And so those were the acts from 2023 and 2024. There are a couple of bills that were voted out of your committee that were included in other bills, most specifically in big bills or appropriations bills. There was a small farmer diversification and transition program, which came out of this committee with $350,000 of financial assistance to farmers to diversify production on a farm or transition from one form of farming to another. It came out of the Senate committee basically with that $350,000 as well. But then the Senate Appropriations Committee chose not to vote on the bill and put the provision in the big bill instead. And when they did that, they only gave the program $150,000. So it passed, but it passed at less than a third of what you had, or a little bit more than a third. And then the other one was the financial assistance to organic dairy farms. As you all know, that they were suffering economically because of the economic conditions, cost of feed, cost of other inputs, cost of just basically everything at the time because of inflation. And they had not qualified for the federal program, which the state was subsidizing farmers to participate in, dairy market margin coverage. And so they asked for this. And then basically approximately $7 million was appropriated to the agency to provide organic dairy farm assistance. I don't know how that program finally shook out. There was some potential need for additional funding. And I think that was provided in 2024 in the big bill, but I can't recall.
There was a conversation about that and a resolution was arrived at.
Yeah,
Not to everyone's satisfaction, as I recall, but I think the matter hasn't come up again. It did go, the appropriations did definitely take a good look at it, say that, both Senate and House last year.
They ran out of money, didn't they? And then they were sold.
there were 2 or 3 farms that either just made the deadline and the money was exhausted, or they had actually gone out of business before and then came back into business, and whether or not they still qualified. And so there was some need to address that. So then there's the bills that passed out of your committee, but were not enacted and were not included in other bills. The most, the highest profile of those would have been the act relating to the fair repair of agricultural equipment. It passed out of the House. It passed the Senate. They had a Senate proposal of amendment to you. You had a proposal of amendment to their proposal of amendment, but that's where it died. It never got to the finish line in those last couple of days. There was also the program to provide financial assistance to the forest economy, basically a pilot program, and adding to some of the existing programs that passed out of your committee, but it did not pass in the Senate. There was also the bill to provide assistance to VOREC. But VOREC is already getting an appropriation, and I think basically what the Appropriations Committee said is that they would handle VOREC through the big bill. And VOREC has been successful. People have been trying to pump it up and to give it more money because it has had success. And honestly, that was you all with Mike, Commissioner Snyder at the time, that did that program. And then the Tree Fruit Farmer Assistance Program. I think you all know there were several weather-related events, freeze down south, flooding. There was a couple of wind events, which really had a significant impact on some of the tree fruit farmers in the state, and they were asking for an assistance program. And ultimately, it did not.
Did it pass out of the House? It didn't even.
I don't think it ever got out of the House. I think it just went to the Appropriations Committee.
Oh,
Yeah.
because it passed out of here, right?
Yeah, it didn't get through the appropriation. committee.
On something that sounds like it's federal dollars. Yeah.
Greg, you need to paint your trees black and white.
Yeah. Get more assistance that way.
Is that, have you reached the end, Mike?
I don't.
Yeah, that's
Oh.
from what everything that there were some other things that you talked about, but never really, action wasn't really taken.
Yeah. The only other thing I would mention is that we, outside of the bills themselves, we were asked to, and we will be asked again to recommend to the Appropriations Committee spending on, for example, the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative and the some of the food insecurity programs that, in addition, last year, so those will come up again this year. And then last year, we did recommend, I think it was $1 million for water quality for logging operations that went into the budget, into the big bill. So there will be things like that aren't going to ever show up on a list of bills that we passed that were enacted, but on our recommendation did make it into law.
That's correct.
Money.
And FPR was setting up a, nothing has happened with that $1 million.
Still happening. Yeah,
It's up to FPR to come up with.
get an update on that too.
Well, I think they don't need to do a rule. I think they just need to do the program. They have an existing program, but part of what you wanted to do is to pay for some more training and certification of harvesters.
Of course.
Right. So that I think is about setting up contracts with people to provide that certification. And that sounds easy, but it can take longer than you would think.
So like the amount used to be a lot that you could get from the agency for a cover crop, and used to be $8,000 per farm. And then it was up to $10,000 last year. Did that come through this committee as a recommendation, or did that come from environment?
So you amended the farm agronomic practices program where cover cropping is under that. I do think you did pump the maximum award under that.
It was greatly received by the farming
And it
community.
was in one of those miscellaneous ag bills, but I don't remember whether it was last year or the year
I
before.
think it was 2023.
Okay.
Yeah, it probably was, because we got those available last year.
Okay, good. Well, as you can see, we kept ourselves busy. John?
Just for memory's sake, it'd be interesting to exhume our letter to approach of what we asked for and see what actual monies, ended up in the big bill too, because I
Yeah.
can't remember. I remember like the last day we were trying to figure out, should this go to crop cash or should this go
Right.
to food bank? Yeah.
You're right. And I think the budget we ultimately passed had quite a lot of contingency spending in it. So
Right.
if it turns out that there was additional revenue, it would go, some of, the first dollar would go here and then so on. And some of that was, I think, for the food bank, for example, or the crop cash program. And as far as I know, that all did get allocated, appropriated. But yeah, we should find out.
So do you want me to talk a little bit about some of the big issues you're gonna?
Do you have a little more time?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, if you want to, maybe spend 15 minutes or so.
So this morning in my email, I got one of my alert emails, noticed that EPA yesterday issued a draft document regarding regulation of PFAS in fertilizer and specifically in biosolid fertilizer, which is that fertilizer which is processed from septic or sewage and then meets certain conditions for land application. So that's a big issue in Vermont. 60% of the state is served by septic, which means you're supposed to pump your system regularly. Nobody actually does it the way that they're supposed to, but they do. It is done. And that material is generally taken to a municipal wastewater treatment plant for processing there. And then municipal wastewater treatment plants have their own material that is produced from their filtration of wastewater. That material, in part, some of it is land applied to fields in the state and specifically to farm fields in the state. And it has PFAS in it. And even according to, and I haven't read the whole document that EPA sent, but even the biosolids, which are sometimes they're called exceptional quality biosolids, they go through an additional process, treatment, heating to eliminate the pathogens. And then they're allowed to be sold, bagged and sold, or just used as fertilizer, as bulk fertilizer. They have PFAS in. Now, PFAS if you all don't know, it's an acronym for poly or per alkyl fluorinated substances, which means that there's a fluorine atom and a carbon atom that are joined to create a chain link of compounds. And it's a very, very effective chemical. It is used to make things like waterproofing on gear or to coat cookingware so it's non-stick. It's in a lot of things. It makes things more flexible. It makes things more shiny. It makes things more kind of frictionless. And it's in a lot of things. But the problem when you add fluorine and carbon together, it's really hard to break down. It doesn't break down naturally. And that's why it's called a forever chemical. And there are 3 ways to deal with PFAS and its disposal. Right now, or let's just say there's 3 ways to deal with municipal wastewater sludge. You land apply it, but you're not treating the PFAS in it. So the PFAS is just now in the environment. You take it to the landfill, which obviously isolates its introduction into the environment, but it's still seeping out of the landfill seepage. So it's still getting into the environment. Or you incinerate wastewater sludge, which you can't do in Vermont, so you have to transport it somewhere else. But PFAS doesn't break down even under incineration, except at very, very high temperatures. So you have this chemical in the environment that is very problematic to dispose of. And it's listed as a potential carcinogen. I was asked down in Senate Ag this morning, how certain are you that it's a carcinogen? It's like, I'm not certain it's a carcinogen. I just know it's on list as a potential carcinogen. So that needs to be likely scientifically confirmed. But you have seen in places like Bennington where there was contamination, where there were cancer clusters there. And they believe it is because of the exposure to PFAS and the environment there.
Representative Marty,
I've read that most of us have that within our bodies.
There was an organization that tested people in Vermont about 5 years ago, including legislators. And I think 90% of the people tested had it in their body. And one of the legislators had like the most.
Is that Senator Campion?
It was Representative McCullough.
That would be surprising because he's the one who's extremely concerned about such.
Yeah.
Representative Lipson.
You know, Mike, I recall PFAS or chemical compounds are very prevalent in fire retardant clothing and
Firefighting foam.
fighting foam materials. And we did hear testimony, I'm not sure here, but I did in other meetings I attended, that some of the highest from I won't even say workman's comp, but the cancer rate among firefighters in some communities was off the charts.
Yeah,
And that was attributed to, I don't know how they attribute to, but the prevalence of those.
Yeah, there are a couple of chemicals that have likely caused those issues. PFAS is one, brominated flame retardants is another. Like plastics previously had bromine, a bromine-based substance in it because bromine doesn't combust readily. And so like your TV would have it, a lot of appliances would have it. But when it finally did catch on fire, it let off this very toxic gas, which firefighters were exposed to and which definitely created health issues.
Chair, thank you. My concern with, PFAS and then the biosolids, refrain from calling it sludge, gets back to what happened in Maine a few years ago when the farm's been condemned, maybe forever.
I think that is the fear that is when you look at this from a farming perspective and you realize that it might be in the soil and that it might be considered a hazardous substance and it might, which means triggering hazardous substance laws and what that means for the use of that land. Yes, I think that is a very anxiety inducing thought.
I've also learned that we have had feedstuffs in the state of Vermont condemned because they found PFAS in it. As far as landfilling it goes, I believe Newport landfills theirs because of the proximity to the landfill, which is 1.7 miles from my house, nothing but air between it and I. And it doesn't leak into the environment there because they assured me that nothing leaks in the environment there because of their wonderful man-made structures that collect it all and they put it in a truck and it's a black tanker and it heads down the road to Montpelier, somewhere here, I believe, and they run it through their treatment facility.
But Montpelier wastewater treatment doesn't treat PFAS.
No, and I don't know where it goes from there, if they apply it to the fields here or if they put it back in the truck, the sludge.
It goes in the water.
Or goes in the water, one or the other, yeah, so it's going to Lake Champlain, but anyway, I would hate. There's some fields that I know used to get sludge applied to them, and it came right from the sewage treatment plant, went direct to the fields. None of our land, none of the land we farm. And you'd have to put me under oath to get me to disclose where they are. I'm sure there are records of them. But I really think this is something that we need to move on.
And wrapped up in that
There's a lot of wrap up in it.
is plastic, microplastic in the soil, in the feed, and what that means as well, and where it's coming from, whether it's coming from inputs that are coming onto the farm, or whether it's coming from the breakdown of stuff that's used on the farm, like the organic farms and their use of black plastic, and whether or not that's breaking down into the soil, the use of the plastic for wrapping, right, and whether or not that's breaking down. And so there's a lot of, because PFAS used to be in plastic, and whether or not they're related, and it's a rabbit hole.
PFAS are also in the plastic of the containers
Right.
that our agrochemicals come in.
But EPA said for pesticides, they're not supposed to anymore. And the company that was making the most containers with PFAS in it for pesticides said that they were going to be stopped. And I think EPA actually ordered them to stop. But you'll have advocates say, no, it's still there because they're testing the pesticide and it's still showing PFAS in it. So that's a little bit of like, who do you put your faith in that argument as well?
Representative Morgan.
And chances are, excuse me, I read that we also have nano and microplastics within our bodies too.
Go ahead, Representative.
Just quickly, Mike, does it travel to in water or air, like if you applied it on a field?
PFAS?
Yeah, does it get picked up in water, evaporation, for example? So our rain actually has PFAS in it, or is it?
That's what happened in Bennington. That's why it spread. It wasn't because there was a land application of it or a spill, it was combusted and it didn't break down at the plant, and it then was deposed through rain and atmospheric deposition to the land,
In wells and things.
right?
And it's being newly found, further and further from the plant as time has allowed it to seep down through the ground to where wells are. Yeah.
And it's still widely used everywhere today, still. This.
So EPA, over the past 4 years, Biden administration started something called the PFAS roadmap to try to address every aspect of, it's in your drinking water, surface water, it's in the soil, it's in hazardous substances. But you're right, the way to deal with this is you got to stop the source.
And we have taken some steps to stop it at the source, to reduce the source over the past couple of years.
You actually asked A&R to come back with a proposal on how to stop sources in Vermont. They came forward with the bill. They reported that in December. It's a pretty good bill, meaning I like how it's drafted. The politics of it are going to be very interesting because it's going to limit the sale of certain goods.
We banned it from clothing, children's clothing anyway, firefighting foam, ski wax, cosmetics last year.
So this bill is going to apply to a lot more than like the specific things that you've regulated. It's going to be pretty much everything unless you qualify for an exemption. But the problem with that bill and the problem you're going to have with regulating PFAS in general is how you define PFAS. Because in some of the bills, it's specific to specific types of chemicals. In some of the other bills, it's anything with a fluorinated compound in it, which expands the universe of products. And so that's the debate. If you're going to go broad, well, then what does that mean? Because A&R's, their proposal is not that. They're more discreet.
Representative Supernat had a question.
So as it relates to divisions of the Agency of Agriculture and the one who specifically is looking at pesticides, are they testing or monitoring or regulating PFAS within them right now?
I don't know if the state agency is, because as the state agency testified last year, and there were some experts, I can't remember if it was in here, if it was in downstairs, where they've testified that there shouldn't be PFAS in pesticides because that would be an adulteration of the pesticide. And if there was, then yeah, the agency would have the ability to prohibit its use. But they were saying that there isn't PFAS in pesticide. But then you had the advocates that were saying, no, we tested it, there's PFAS in there. And part of that conversation was whether or not the PFAS was seeping from the container that it was sold in. And that right when the committee downstairs was talking about it, EPA issued an order to the company that was producing many of those containers to stop using PFAS in their containers. I don't know how that was implemented, whether or not, but theoretically, there shouldn't be PFAS in pesticides or in the pesticide container anymore. I'm sure somebody's going to test it and say that there's PFAS in some pesticide. And so what you do with that, that's your policy.
We've got, a lot of questions in this subject. I want to just maybe put up a 3-minute warning before we take a break. And then, Mike, I know you had other topics that we can have you back in later in the week, or
Yes, sit in my actually scheduled later in the week. Or no, that's downstairs, sorry.
We can find some time, either this week or next week.
Okay, I mean, I have until 11:15.
We've got another witness at 10:45.
Okay.
But let's see, we had a couple other questions. Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, this is such an important issue and, what's said in this committee needs to be sort of accurate. So I love to learn because I've heard that, up the Coventry landfill has still been taking some, but, sludge solids that have, PFAS, but they were phasing that out and that our only market within a region was in the province of Quebec and Sherbrooke, but the Canadian government was producing that. So what went into a truck that we implied might end up in Lake Champlain, I think we need to try to understand the accuracy of what the Casella facility takes, doesn't take, because our community 2 years ago was shipping there and then making arrangements to ship to Quebec. So this is what we call it's not.
It's a fast shifting.
Yeah, it's moving, but I
Right.
think for our own constituents and our own area of responsibility.
And the guy,
Truth or accuracy, we could.
the person to talk to is Eamon Tuhig at the Agency of Natural Resources. He's the one that's been in charge of the land application program. And so he'll know where things are going now.
And just incidentally, yesterday, Director Achilles, who's the head of the environmental laboratory in Randolph, reported that they now have the capacity to test up to the 553 level for PFAS. On my way home, I called our DPW guy. He says, we haven't been notified. And it's very expensive to get testing done. So anything we can learn to help our constituents, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Representative Burke.
Fluoride in drinking water, does that have any connection?
No, but it's that. I would say no, because what the PFAS issue is that combination with carbon and the fact that it won't break down. Fluorine on its own can break down, but there is significant concern that the use of fluorine in drinking water has secondary effects not necessarily addressed when fluorine was approved for use in drinking water or required for use. So that's going to play out. There's supposedly going to be a review of that at the federal level. What, if any, amount should be used and what, if any, secondary effects are there?
Representative O'Brien.
Just, how pervasive are PFAS chemicals too? Like, chances are we can find some in these apples or this water. And then is there an agreed sort of, it has to be below so many parts per trillion? Like, is that the target?
It depends on which substance you're talking about and the action level. Vermont's action levels are actually higher right now than the Fed action level for certain material, certain media. And whether and how to adjust that is going to be interesting. And then the manufacturers will tell you that there's potentially always a de minimis or a contaminated level. So that it's very interesting when you talk to them, they don't necessarily know what's in their product because they're sourcing from others, right? And they don't necessarily know what's in the source material that they're getting. And so there might have been a contamination issue with the input that they received for, and they don't know about that. And so it's pretty interesting when you start talking to them about how they're sourcing and manufacturing what they know is in the product.
All right, let's take one more question.
I could talk about this all day long. I really could, but anyways, a lot of the stuff sourced from China and you can trust them. I'll leave it at that.
All right,
Let's let them make our food too.
why don't we leave it at that? And we will no doubt be taking this topic up again soon, and we'll have you back then, Mike, too. Let's figure that out. Let's take a break. We've got
Could I just,
witness at 11 or 10:45, so stay, 10 minutes or something. Yeah.
before I leave, the other big issue is ag water quality, and that's like a whole other significant.
Yeah, I deserve more than a minute.